The flames danced against the night sky, casting an eerie glow over Hazel Whitfield's face as she watched everything she had ever known crumble to ash. The grand Whitfield mansion, once the crown jewel of Laramie, Wyoming territory, was now nothing more than a smoldering skeleton against the backdrop of the 1876 frontier landscape. Hazel stood barefoot in her nightgown, a woolen blanket wrapped around her shoulders by some kind soul whose face she couldn't even recall. Her golden hair, usually pinned in elaborate curls, hung loose and singed around her tear-streaked face. The fire had taken everything: her parents, their fortune, her future. At 23, she was suddenly alone and destitute in a world that showed little mercy to women without means. "Miss Whitfield," Sheriff Miller approached cautiously, his weathered face somber in the dying firelight. "I'm mighty sorry about your loss. Do you have any family we can contact?" Hazel shook her head numbly. Her mother's relatives were back east, distant people she'd never met who probably wouldn't even recognize her name. Her father had been the last of his line. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke and screaming. "There's no one." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we can't have you staying out here. The hotel's full with the cattle buyers in town, but I'm sure someone can take you in until I'll take her." Both Hazel and the sheriff turned toward the deep voice. Xander Owens stood a few feet away, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying embers of what had once been her home. The local rancher removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with dust and ash. His face was solemn, blue eyes reflecting the orange glow of the remaining flames. "Mr. Owens," the sheriff acknowledged, "that's kind of you, but my daughter Sarah is about her age," Xander continued. "We've got a spare room at the ranch. It ain't much, but it's clean and warm." Hazel recognized him vaguely. Xander Owens, a widower with a small ranch outside of town. A man who struggled to make ends meet, whose worn clothes and calloused hands spoke of hard work and little reward. She had seen him occasionally in town, usually with a young girl trailing behind him. They had never moved in the same social circles. Her father, the banking magnate of Laramie, would never have associated with a struggling rancher. "I can't accept charity," Hazel said stiffly, clinging to the last shreds of her dignity. "It ain't charity, Miss Whitfield." Xander's voice was quiet but firm. "It's what neighbors do." The sheriff cleared his throat. "It's a good offer, Miss Whitfield, just until we can sort things out." He lowered his voice. "The bank will need to be notified about your father's passing. There'll be matters to settle." Hazel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Her father's bank, would there be anything left for her? Or had the fire destroyed that too in some terrible way? She had never concerned herself with such matters, having been raised to be the perfect society wife, not a businesswoman. "Very well," she conceded, too numb to argue further. "Thank you, Mr. Owens." Xander nodded once, then turned to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood patiently nearby. "Can you ride, Miss Whitfield?" "Yes," she answered automatically. Her father had spared no expense on riding lessons, though she had only ever ridden side saddle in the finest English tack. Xander helped her up onto his horse, then swung himself behind her. The intimate proximity to this stranger, this cowboy, would have scandalized her mother. But her mother was gone now, along with all the rules and expectations that had governed Hazel's life. They rode in silence through the darkened streets of Laramie. A few townsfolk were still awake, drawn by the commotion of the fire. They watched curiously as the unlikely pair passed by the town's wealthiest daughter and the struggling rancher. The Owens Ranch lay 5 miles outside town, a modest spread with a small house and a few outbuildings. As they approached, Hazel could see a lantern burning in the window, casting a warm, inviting glow against the darkness. A slender girl about 16 rushed out as they approached. "Pa, we saw the fire from here. Is everything?" She stopped short when she spotted Hazel. "Sarah," Xander said as he dismounted, then helped Hazel down. "This is Miss Whitfield. She'll be staying with us for a while." Sarah's eyes widened with recognition, and Hazel felt a fresh wave of humiliation. Even out here, people knew the Whitfields, knew their wealth, their standing. And now they would know their downfall. "The bank man's daughter," Sarah whispered, then immediately flushed with embarrassment. "I mean, I'm sorry about the fire, Miss Whitfield." Thank you, Hazel replied stiffly, clutching the borrowed blanket tighter around herself. Sarah, show Miss Whitfield to the spare room, Xander instructed. I'll stable Thunder and be right in. The spare room turned out to be little more than a storage space hastily converted for a guest. A narrow bed with a simple quilt occupied one corner. A small dresser with a cracked mirror stood against the wall. The wooden floor was bare except for a small rag rug beside the bed. It ain't much, Sarah said apologetically, but it's clean. Hazel swallowed hard. Just yesterday, she had slept in a 4-poster bed with silk sheets and a goose-down mattress. Her dressing room had been larger than this entire space. It's fine, she managed. Thank you. Sarah hovered uncertainly. I can bring you a nightgown and maybe some clothes for tomorrow. We're about the same size, I reckon. The thought of wearing a simple farm girl's clothes made Hazel want to weep, but she had no alternatives. Her entire wardrobe, the Paris gowns, the silk stockings, the kid gloves and custom boots all gone. That would be kind of you, she said softly. After Sarah left, Hazel sank onto the edge of the bed. The reality of her situation began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. Her parents were dead. Her home and possessions were gone. Her fortune, she wasn't even sure if that existed anymore. And now she was dependent on the charity of a poor rancher who could hardly afford to feed an extra mouth. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Xander stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway. He'd removed his hat and coat and washed the soot from his face. Without the shadows and firelight, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His face was tanned from long days under the sun, and a small scar ran along his jawline. I brought you some water to wash up, he said, setting a basin on the dresser. And Sarah's getting you some things to wear. Thank you, Mr. Owens. I don't know how to repay your kindness. There's nothing to repay, he said simply. We help each other out here on the frontier. That's how folks survive. Hazel nodded, though the concept was foreign to her. In her world, everything had a price, every favor carried an expectation of return. Try to get some rest, Xander continued. Morning comes early around here. After he left, Hazel washed her face and hands in the cool water. Sarah brought a faded but clean cotton nightgown and a simple dress for the morning. When she was finally alone, Hazel curled up on the unfamiliar bed and wept silently until exhaustion claimed her. Morning announced itself with the crow of a rooster and the smell of coffee and bacon. Hazel awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was and what had happened. The reality crashed back with sickening force, and she lay still for several minutes, gathering the strength to face this new day, this new life. The dress Sarah had lent her was plain homespun cotton, a far cry from the fine fabrics Hazel was accustomed to. It was also slightly too short, exposing her ankles in a way that would have scandalized her mother. But it was clean and serviceable, and Hazel had no right to complain. She made her way tentatively to the kitchen, where she found Sarah cooking at the wood stove. The girl looked up with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. Good morning, Miss Whitfield. I hope you slept well as could be expected, Hazel replied honestly. And please call me Hazel. Sarah's smile widened. Hazel then. Pa's already out doing chores. He said to tell you breakfast will be ready soon. Hazel stood awkwardly, unsure of her role in this household. Is there anything I can do to help? Sarah looked surprised, then pleased. You could set the table if you like. Plates are in that cupboard there. The domesticity of the task felt strange to Hazel. At home, servants had handled such things. But she set 3 places at the simple wooden table, trying to remember how Sarah had arranged things the previous night. Xander came in just as the food was ready, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and horses. He'd been up for hours, Hazel realized, working while she slept. Morning, he said with a nod to Hazel. Sleep all right? Yes, thank you. They ate in relative silence, the simple meal of bacon, biscuits, and coffee, a stark contrast to the elaborate breakfasts Hazel was accustomed to. Yet she found herself hungry, the food satisfying in a basic way. I need to go into town today, Xander said as they finished eating. To talk to the sheriff and maybe the bank about your situation, Miss Whitfield. Hazel, she corrected automatically, And I should go with you. There will be arrangements to make for my parents. A shadow crossed Xander's face. Are you sure you're up to that? I have to be, she replied simply. After breakfast, Hazel helped Sarah clear the dishes, ignoring the girl's protests that she was a guest. It felt good to be useful, to have something to do with her hands while her mind grappled with the enormity of her loss. The ride into Laramie was quiet, Hazel once again perched in front of Xander on his horse. In daylight, she could see the true state of his ranch, the fence posts that needed mending, the barn that sagged slightly to one side, the sparse cattle grazing in the distance. It was a hardscrabble existence, and she felt a new wave of guilt for imposing on this family that clearly had so little to spare. The town was abuzz with news of the fire. People stopped and stared as Xander helped Hazel down from the horse in front of the sheriff's office. She could hear their whispers, see the mixture of pity and morbid curiosity in their eyes. Hazel lifted her chin and straightened her spine, calling on years of social training to mask her emotions. Sheriff Miller was direct but kind as he explained what they knew about the fire. It had started in the kitchen, likely a stove left unattended, and spread rapidly through the dry wood of the old mansion. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late for her parents, who had been asleep upstairs. We'll arrange for a proper burial, the sheriff assured her. The whole town will want to pay their respects to your father. He was a well-regarded man. Next came the bank, where the news was equally grim. While her father's financial affairs would take time to untangle, the initial assessment was bleak. Harold Whitfield had leveraged his personal fortune heavily in recent railroad investments that had not yet paid off. The bank itself was on solid ground, but it appeared that much of the Whitfield personal wealth existed on paper rather than in actual assets. I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield, the bank manager said, genuine regret in his voice. Your father was a visionary, but sometimes vision runs ahead of reality. Once all debts are settled, I fear there may be very little left. Hazel sat very still, absorbing this latest blow. She had gone from one of the wealthiest young women in the Wyoming Territory to a pauper in the span of a night. What about the insurance on the house? Xander asked from beside her. The manager shifted uncomfortably. I'm afraid Mr. Whitfield had let the policy lapse about 3 months ago. He was confident his investments would turn around soon. Outside the bank, Hazel paused on the boardwalk, feeling dizzy with the implications of everything she'd learned. Xander stood quietly beside her, a steady presence in the storm of her emotions. What will I do? She whispered, more to herself than to him. You'll survive, he answered simply. People do. She looked up at him, seeing the quiet strength in his weathered face. This man knew about survival, about facing hardship head-on without flinching. Mr. Owens Xander, she said, using his first name for the first time. I cannot continue to impose on your kindness. You and Sarah have so little, and you have nowhere else to go, he interrupted gently. And we have a roof and food to share. It's settled. But I'm not accustomed to accepting charity. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Then don't think of it as charity. Think of it as a loan. When you're back on your feet, you can repay us if it makes you feel better. Hazel nodded slowly. A loan that she could accept, at least temporarily. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and legal meetings. The town turned out in force to lay Harold and Elizabeth Whitfield to rest, many genuinely grieving the loss of the couple who had brought prosperity to Laramie through the bank and Harold's various business ventures. Hazel stood dry-eyed through the service, acutely aware of her borrowed dress and the whispers that followed her. Xander remained steadfastly at her side, his quiet strength a comfort she hadn't expected to need so desperately. The will reading the following day confirmed what the bank manager had already suggested. Once all debts were settled, Hazel would inherit little more than personal effects jewelry her mother had kept in a safety deposit box, a few family heirlooms that had been stored elsewhere, and whatever meager sum remained after creditors were paid. It's enough to start over somewhere, the lawyer suggested kindly. Perhaps with relatives back east, but Hazel found herself reluctant to reach out to those distant connections. What would they think of Harold Whitfield's daughter arriving on their doorstep, destitute and desperate? No, she would find her own way somehow. As days turned into weeks, Hazel began to adapt to life at the Owens ranch. She insisted on earning her keep, taking on household duties that Sarah had previously managed alone. At first, her efforts were clumsy. She had never cooked a meal, never laundered clothes, never churned butter or gathered eggs. Sarah proved to be a patient teacher, showing Hazel how to manage the simple tasks of running a frontier household without servants. The girl seemed to enjoy having female company, and Hazel found herself growing fond of Sarah's bright spirit and practical nature. Xander was often absent during daylight hours, working his small herd of cattle or taking odd jobs to bring in extra money. Hazel gradually realized just how precarious the ranch's finances were. Xander worked from dawn until dusk, every day, just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. One evening, about a month after the fire, Hazel found Xander at the kitchen table after Sarah had gone to bed. He was poring over a ledger, his face tight with concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked hesitantly. He looked up, clearly surprised to find her still awake. "Just going over the numbers, nothing for you to worry about." Hazel took a seat across from him. "I've imposed on you long enough, Xander. I should be finding my own way." "And where would you go?" he asked, closing the ledger. "What would you do?" "I could work at the general store, perhaps, or the hotel might need help." Xander shook his head. "Those aren't fitting jobs for someone like you." "Someone like me?" Hazel felt a flash of irritation. "You mean someone useless, someone who's never worked a day in her life." "That's not what I meant." His voice remained calm in the face of her anger. "I meant someone educated, someone raised for better things." "Better things," she repeated bitterly. "Those better things are gone, Xander, burned to ash or claimed by creditors. This is my reality now." He studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You're stronger than you know, Hazel Whitfield." The compliment caught her off guard. "I don't feel strong, I feel lost." "We're all lost sometimes," he replied softly. "The trick is to keep moving anyway." The following day, Hazel accompanied Xander into town to sell eggs and butter from the ranch. It was her first visit to Laramie since the funeral, and she felt self-conscious in her borrowed dress and simple bonnet. But Xander treated her with a quiet respect that helped her hold her head high as they made their rounds. At the general store, they encountered Mrs. Patterson, the town's most notorious gossip. The older woman's eyes widened at the sight of Hazel with Xander. "Miss Whitfield, how unexpected to see you here." Her gaze flickered between Hazel and Xander. "I had heard you were staying out at the Owens place, but I scarcely believed it." "Mr. Owens and his daughter have been very kind," Hazel replied politely. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice to a stage whisper. "My dear, there are those in town who would take you in. More suitable arrangements could be made." Hazel felt Xander stiffen beside her, though his face remained impassive. "I find my current arrangements entirely suitable, thank you," Hazel said firmly. "The Owens family has shown me true Christian charity when I most needed it." Mrs. Patterson looked unconvinced. "Well, if you change your mind, Reverend Mills mentioned that his sister is looking for a companion. It would be a respectable position for someone in your circumstances." After she moved away, Hazel turned to find Xander watching her with an unreadable expression. "She means well," Hazel offered, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to defend the gossipy woman. "Does she?" Xander asked mildly. "Seems to me she's more concerned with appearances than with what might actually be best for you." "And what would be best for me, in your opinion?" Hazel challenged. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Whatever makes you happy, Miss Whitfield." The simple statement caught her off guard. In all her 23 years, no one had ever suggested that her happiness should be the primary consideration in her life choices. She had been raised to fulfill expectations, to make a good match, to uphold the family name. Happiness was incidental, if it came at all. As summer progressed, Hazel found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. Her hands grew calloused from work, her skin tanned from the sun. The fine lady of Laramie was gradually disappearing, replaced by a woman who could churn butter, mend clothes, and even help with the vegetable garden. She sold some of her mother's jewelry, the few pieces that hadn't been claimed by creditors, and insisted on contributing to the household expenses. Xander initially resisted, but Hazel was adamant. "I'm not a charity case," she declared one evening after dinner. "I'm earning my keep and I'll pay my way." Something flickered in Xander's eyes, respect, perhaps, or admiration. "You're a remarkable woman, Hazel Whitfield." The compliment warmed her in unexpected ways, and she found herself thinking of Xander in terms that went beyond gratitude. She noticed the strength in his hands, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his voice when he read to Sarah in the evenings. But surely such thoughts were foolish. Xander had never given any indication that he saw her as anything more than a responsibility, a neighbor in need. And even if he did harbor feelings for her, what future could there be for them? He was struggling to keep his ranch afloat, and she had nothing to offer but another mouth to feed. One scorching July afternoon, Hazel was hanging laundry on the line when she heard a horse approaching at speed. She shaded her eyes against the sun to see Xander galloping toward the house, an unusual urgency in his posture. "What is it?" she called as he dismounted. "Is something wrong?" "Got word from town," he said, his voice tight. "The railroad's finally coming through." Hazel felt a surge of hope. "But that's good news, isn't it? My father always said the railroad would bring prosperity to Laramie." "It is good news," Xander agreed. "But the route they're taking it cuts right through the eastern pasture, my best grazing land." The implications dawned on Hazel slowly. "They'll compensate you, won't they, for the land?" "Some," he conceded, "but not enough to make up for the loss of that pasture. And with the drought this summer." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "What will you do?" Xander squared his shoulders. "What I've always done, adapt and keep going." But over the next few weeks, Hazel could see the toll the situation was taking on him. The railroad surveyors came and went, marking the path that would slice through the heart of the ranch's best land. The compensation offered was insultingly low, as land speculation had already driven up prices everywhere except where sellers were desperate. One evening, Hazel found Xander sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the twilight landscape. Sarah had gone to bed early with a headache, leaving them alone. "May I join you?" Hazel asked softly. He nodded, moving over to make room for her on the step. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sound cicadas, distant coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the corral. "I've been thinking," Hazel said eventually, "about what my father would have done in this situation." Xander gave her a sideways glance. "What's that?" "He would have looked for the opportunity hidden in the challenge." She turned to face him more directly. "The railroad means people, Xander, workers during construction, passengers afterward, people who need food, supplies, and beef." He frowned slightly. "I already sell beef to the town. But the railroad camp will need more. And then when the line is running, you could ship cattle east, where prices are higher." Her mind was racing now, drawing on fragments of business conversations she'd overheard at her father's dinner table. "You could even consider shifting more toward breeding stock rather than beef cattle. Quality bulls bring premium prices." Xander was watching her with growing interest. "You've got a head for business, Hazel," she smiled ruefully. "I should. I spent my whole life listening to my father talk about nothing else. I just never thought I'd need to understand it myself." "Well, your ideas have merit." He looked thoughtful. "But all of that takes capital I don't have. I'd need to expand the herd, improve the bloodlines." "What about a loan from the bank?" He shook his head. "Already leveraged as far as they'll go, and with the railroad taking my best land, they're not likely to extend more credit." Hazel bit her lip, thinking, then an idea struck her. What if you had a partner? A partner? Xander looked skeptical. "Who would partner with a struggling rancher like me?" "Me," Hazel said simply. He stared at her for a long moment. "You, Hazel, you don't have, I have this," she interrupted, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small velvet pouch. She opened it to reveal a gleaming diamond ring. "My mother's engagement ring, the one thing I couldn't bring myself to sell. The jeweler in Cheyenne said it's worth at least $500. Xander's eyes widened. "That's a small fortune." "It's an investment," Hazel corrected. "In the ranch, in our future." The word "our" hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither of them had spoken aloud before. "Hazel," Xander said softly, "I can't take your mother's ring. You wouldn't be taking it. It would be an investment, a business arrangement." We'd be partners. She took a deep breath. Unless you'd prefer I leave, I know I've been a burden. No, his voice was firm. You've never been a burden, you've been a blessing. The confession seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. In the dim light, Hazel could see a vulnerability in his eyes she'd never witnessed before. Xander, she whispered, what are you saying? He took her hand, his calloused palm rough against her skin. I'm saying I don't want you as a business partner, Hazel, I want. He hesitated, then continued more softly, I want more than that. Hazel's heart thundered in her chest. What do you want? She asked, needing to hear him say it. I want you, he said simply. By my side, not as a guest or a partner, but as my wife, if you could ever see your way to loving a man like me. Tears sprang to Hazel's eyes. A man like you, she repeated. You mean a man who gave everything he had to a stranger, who worked himself to exhaustion to provide for his daughter and for me. Who never once made me feel like a burden or a charity case. She squeezed his hand. Xander Owens, I already love a man like you. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, Xander rested his forehead against hers. I don't have much to offer you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. This ranch, this life, it's hard work with little reward. You're wrong, Hazel countered. You've offered me the only thing that matters, a home. A place to belong, love. She smiled through her tears. Everything else we'll figure out together. Their wedding 2 months later was a simple affair at the small church in Laramie. Sarah, beaming with happiness, stood as Hazel's attendant. The entire town turned out, curiosity mingling with genuine goodwill for the unlikely couple. Mrs. Patterson could be overheard telling anyone who would listen that she had always seen the potential between the banker's daughter and the humble rancher. A true love match, she declared with authority, as though she had orchestrated it herself. With Hazel's diamond ring converted to capital and Xander's knowledge of cattle, they implemented her business plan. They secured contracts to supply beef to the railroad construction camps, reinvesting the profits into improving their breeding stock. The first year was lean, with both of them working from dawn until dusk to make the ranch profitable. But by the time the railroad was completed through Laramie in 1877, the Owens Ranch had established a reputation for quality beef and breeding stock that commanded premium prices. Sarah, blossoming into a confident young woman under Hazel's guidance, took charge of the ranch's accounts, revealing an aptitude for numbers that rivaled Hazel's business instincts. The three of them formed a seamless team, each contributing their strengths to the family enterprise. In the spring of 1878, Hazel gave birth to a son they named Daniel Harold Owens, honoring both Xander's father and Hazel's. As she watched Xander holding their newborn with such tender care, Hazel marveled at how drastically her life had changed in just 2 years. What are you thinking? Xander asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. I was thinking about the fire, she admitted. How I thought it was the end of everything, and now, she smiled, reaching out to touch his cheek, now I know it was just the beginning. By 1880, the Owens Ranch had expanded to 3 times its original size. They built a new house not as grand as the Whitfield mansion had been, but spacious and comfortable, with room for their growing family. A daughter, Emma Elizabeth, joined them in 1879, followed by twin boys, James and Joseph, in 1882. Hazel never regretted the loss of her former life of luxury and ease. The satisfaction of building something meaningful with Xander, of raising their children in an atmosphere of love and purpose, far outweighed any comfort that wealth alone could have provided. One autumn evening in 1885, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, Xander took Hazel's hand. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "Your old life?" Hazel considered the question seriously. "I miss my parents," she answered honestly. "I wish they could have known you, known our children." She squeezed his hand. "But this life we've built together, I wouldn't trade it for all the mansions in the world." From the doorway came the sound of children's laughter as Sarah, now a poised young woman of 25, herded her younger siblings inside for supper. She had turned down several suitors over the years, claiming she was content with her role in the family and the ranch. Hazel suspected there was more to the story, perhaps a heart given elsewhere that couldn't be reciprocated, but Sarah kept her own counsel on such matters. "We've been blessed," Xander said softly, watching his expanded family with evident pride. "We have," Hazel agreed. "But I've been blessed most of all." He raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure that?" "Because I lost everything," she explained, "and in losing it, I found what really mattered." Xander leaned over to kiss her, a gesture that still sent warmth coursing through her after nearly a decade of marriage. "Come on, Mrs. Owens, your family's waiting." Hand in hand, they rose and entered their home, where the table was set and their children waited, the simple routines of their life together more precious than any wealth could measure. The years continued to bring changes to the Owens Ranch. By 1890, it had become one of the most successful operations in the region, known for its progressive methods and quality stock. Sarah eventually married a quiet, intelligent man who ran the telegraph office in Laramie, though she maintained her involvement in the ranch's business affairs. Daniel, their eldest, showed his father's affinity for working with animals and his mother's head for business. At 16, he was already taking on significant responsibilities in the daily operation of the ranch. Emma, at 15, was the scholar of the family, devouring books and dreaming of attending university, a dream both Hazel and Xander encouraged, having learned the value of education through their own experiences. The twins, James and Joseph, were inseparable bundles of energy at 12, always found in the middle of whatever mischief was brewing but equally eager to help with ranch work when called upon. Hazel and Xander's youngest child, a daughter they named Grace, arrived unexpectedly when Hazel was 40, a final blessing that completed their family circle. At 5 years old, Grace combined her siblings' best qualities: Daniel's steadiness, Emma's curiosity, and the twins' joyful spirit. On the 20th anniversary of the fire that had changed Hazel's life, the entire family gathered for a special dinner. Now 60 years old but still straight-backed and strong, Xander raised his glass in a toast. "To the fire," he said, surprising everyone at the table. "The destruction that led to creation. The ending that became our beginning." Hazel, her once golden hair now streaked with silver but her eyes as bright as ever, met his gaze with understanding. "To new beginnings," she echoed, lifting her own glass. That night, after the children had gone to bed, they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, looking out at the prosperous ranch that stretched before them, the tangible result of their joint vision and hard work. "Did you ever imagine this?" Hazel asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "That night when you found me standing in front of the burning ruins of my old life," Xander wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "No," he admitted. "I just knew a woman who needed help. I never dreamed she'd end up saving me right back." "Saving you?" Hazel turned to look up at him. "How did I save you?" "I was drowning, Hazel." His voice was quiet in the darkness. "Trying to keep this ranch afloat, raise Sarah alone, just barely hanging on, and then you came with your ideas, your determination, your love." He kissed the top of her head. "You made me believe in possibilities again." Hazel smiled, remembering the desperate young woman she had been and the quiet strength of the man who had offered her shelter when she had nothing left. "We saved each other," she said softly, "and built something neither of us could have created alone." In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the railroad that had once threatened their livelihood now an integral part of their success. Hazel thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. The fire that had seemed like an ending had actually been a doorway to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. "Shall we go in?" Xander asked, noticing a slight shiver pass through her in the cool night air. "In a moment," Hazel replied, wanting to savor this perfect peace a little longer. "I'm just thinking how fortunate I am." "Fortunate," Xander's voice held a note of wonder. "After losing everything?" "I didn't lose everything," Hazel corrected gently. "I lost possessions, position, wealth. But I found love, purpose, family." She turned in his arms to face him. "I found you." The kiss they shared was as tender as their first, yet deepened by the decades of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges that had forged their bond. As they finally turned to go inside, Hazel cast one last glance at the star-filled Wyoming sky. She sent a silent thanks to her parents, believing somehow that they would understand and approve of the life she had built from the ashes of their legacy. Not a life of privilege and ease, but one of meaning and love, the true wealth that could never be destroyed by fire or misfortune. Inside, the home they had created together waited, warm and welcoming. Their children slept peacefully under its roof, dreaming of their own futures on the foundation Hazel and Xander had built. The humble ranch that had once been a temporary refuge had become the center of a thriving family enterprise and the setting for a love story neither of them had anticipated. "Come on, Mrs. Owens," Xander said, extending his hand. "Tomorrow's another day of work to be done." Hazel took his hand as she had that night long ago when he had offered her shelter from the ashes of her former life. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Mr. Owens," she replied. "Not for all the world." As they stepped inside, closing the door on the starlit landscape of their ranch, Hazel knew with absolute certainty that she had found something far more precious than all she had lost. In giving her everything he had, his home, his heart, his future, Xander Owens had helped her discover that true wealth lay not in possessions or position, but in the bonds of love and family that could weather any storm, survive any loss, and transform even the darkest night into the promise of a new dawn. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the ranch prospered, that promise continued to unfold in ways neither Hazel nor Xander could have foreseen on that fateful night when fire had seemed to end all hope. Instead, it had been just the beginning of their story, a story of loss and finding, of giving and receiving, and ultimately, of a love strong enough to build a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.